when we look back at the most terrifying totalitarian regimes in history, there's this very specific, almost cinematic image that instantly comes to mind.
Oh, yeah. Like the dark, evil genius trope.
Exactly. We picture these masterminds. We imagine them orchestrating these vast, horrific machines of state control with this cold, calculating brilliance.
Right. We assume that to cause that much damage to the world, you just must possess some kind of overwhelming, albeit dark, intellect.
But what if that entire image, that whole terrifying aura, is just a complete lie?
It's a fascinating question.
I mean, what if the most brutal dictators of the 20th century weren't brilliant architects of history at all? What if they were actually profoundly, staggeringly mediocre individuals?
Mediocre men who were simply using the apparatus of state terror to mask their own deep, unresolvable psychological complexes.
Yes. And that premise completely flips the script on how we understand both power and historical trauma.
It really does.
Yeah.
Because we are deeply conditioned, almost by human nature, to associate massive historical impact with massive intellect, even if that intellect is malevolent.
Right. It makes us feel a bit safer, ironically.
Exactly. We want to think it takes a genius to break the world. But the historical and psychological reality is often far more pathetic.
And in a very real way, far more disturbing. To realize that millions of lives were destroyed not by dark wizards, but by deeply insecure, intellectually vacant men.
Absolutely.
And that unsettling reality is exactly what we are getting into today. So welcome to the Deep Dive. We are unpacking a truly fascinating essay today titled The Architecture of Mediocrity, Philosophy and Psychopathology in Fascism.
It's a dense one, but so revealing.
It really is. And our mission for this deep dive is to take you, yes, you listening right now, behind the curtain. We're going to look past the immaculate tailored uniforms.
Past the grand imperial rhetoric.
Right. And far past those meticulously staged hypnotic rallies of Nazi Germany and fascist Spain. Because what this essay reveals is that if you peek right behind that imposing theatrical curtain, you don't find a brain trust.
Not at all.
You find an absolute vacuum of intellect, an array of severe clinical disorders, and some genuinely bizarre personal paraphilias.
But before we jump in, we want to make it absolutely clear to you that we are imparting the content of this specific essay.
Right, an important note.
Yes. We are not endorsing or taking sides on any of the political or religious viewpoints presented, but simply acting as your guides to convey the historical, psychological, and philosophical arguments contained within the source material.
Exactly. We're looking at this strictly as an analysis of history and human behavior, exploring the claims made by the authors and researchers cited in the text.
Precisely.
Okay, let's unpack this. Let's start with the very foundation of this entire illusion. Why does a totalitarian regime even need an intellectual alibi in the first place?
That's the core question, isn't it?
I mean, think about it practically. If you are a dictator and you have an absolute monopoly on violence, you control the police, the military, the courts.
You have all the hard power.
Right. And you have a designated scapegoat to blame all your country's problems on, like the Jewish population for the Nazis or the Freemasons and Marxists for the Spanish fascists.
Mm-hmm.
Why isn't that enough?
Mm-hmm.
Why go through the massive, exhausting trouble of inventing an entire incredibly dense philosophical framework just to justify what you were doing?
Well, because, simply put, brute force is exhausting. And more importantly, it is highly brittle.
Brittle? How do you mean?
A regime built solely on the naked application of violence is constantly vulnerable to rebellion because everyone knows it's just a gang of thugs holding them hostage.
That's right. It's too obvious.
Exactly. To sustain power over the long term, like across generations, these regimes need to convince not just the masses they are oppressing, but crucially, they need to convince themselves that their barbarism isn't actually a crime.
They need to believe it is a higher historical destiny.
Precisely. They have a pathological need to coat their most cruel, base instincts in this thick veneer of high culture, mysticism, and classical philosophy.
So they need to sleep at night. They need to look in the mirror and see a savior, not a butcher.
It performs a vital psychological alchemy. It turns mass murder from a dirty criminal act into a sacred historical duty.
Because if you are just shooting your political rivals, you're a mobster.
Right. But if you are purging the nation to fulfill the destiny laid out by ancient philosophers and biological science, well, then you are a hero of history.
Wow. So if you need that alibi, how do you build it from scratch when your actual leadership is intellectually bankrupt?
You build a set.
Yeah, a massive, terrifying theater set. designed so imposingly that no one would ever dare look backstage to see the flimsy wooden props holding it up.
And to build this fake intellectual facade, the fascists of the 20th century essentially decided to engage in the most lethal form of historical cosplay ever attempted.
Cosplaying the Roman Empire.
It was an absolute all-consuming obsession, particularly in Mussolini's Italy and Hitler's Germany. They weren't just, vaguely inspired by Rome.
They wanted to be Rome.
They were trying to literally resurrect it. If you look at the architecture they favored, the monumental, imposing concrete structures.
The sweeping colonnades.
Yeah, the vast arenas designed to make the individual human feel as small and insignificant as an ant. It was a direct visual ripoff of Roman imperial architecture.
And it wasn't just buildings, right? It was the aesthetics of the military.
Oh, absolutely. The stiff-armed military salutes, the relentless, aggressive push for military expansionism to conquer neighboring territories.
It's like they were trying to draft off the credibility of the Caesars.
The stated goal was to recreate a new empire where a united Europe under a single divinely inspired dictator and an invincible army would dominate the world. Exactly as the Romans did for centuries.
But they had no genuine historical pedigree of their own that justified that kind of continental domination.
None at all. So they relied on ancient myths and highly fantasized, cherry-picked histories to graft themselves onto a legacy of greatness.
Right. They needed to invent a glorious mythic past to justify a terrifying radical future. And you can't build a mythic past without addressing religion. Religion played a massive role in this theater set. But the way it was utilized was incredibly contradictory when you compare the fascist movements in Spain to those in Germany.
The contrast is one of the most fascinating aspects of 20th century fascism. In Spain, the mainstream fascist movement, the one that eventually coalesced under Francisco Franco, was deeply, genuinely, and structurally ultra-Catholic.
So it was an act for them.
No, not at all. They were heavily supported by the Spanish Catholic Church hierarchy, and at the time, the incredibly powerful and influential Jesuit order.
Wow.
Their use of religion was deeply embedded in the actual historical traditions of the Spanish Inquisition and the monarchy. The church and the state were inextricably linked in a shared project of moral and political control.
But in Germany, that dynamic was completely different. It was entirely opportunistic, wasn't it?
Completely opportunistic, because the upper echelons of the Nazi elite actually despised Judeo-Christian values.
Wait, they actively hated it.
They loathed them. The Nazi ideology was fundamentally incompatible with Christianity. They viewed Judeo-Christian concepts of mercy, compassion, turning the other cheek, and the inherent value of every individual soul as a pathetic weakness.
They thought it was a disease.
Yes, a disease that had infected the strong, warlike Germanic spirit.
So how do you govern a country that is largely Christian if you hate Christianity?
You hijack it temporarily.
So they exploit it as a political tool.
Precisely. In the early days, they positioned themselves in their propaganda as the great, muscular defenders of the Christian faith against the tide of atheist communism sweeping in from the Soviet Union.
That is a highly convenient, very effective political shield.
It was perfect for winning over the middle class and rural conservatives. But the long-term plan, which is documented in the Inner Circle's correspondence, was that once their power was fully, permanently consolidated and the war was won, they intended to aggressively scrap Christianity altogether.
Just outlaw it completely.
Yeah, they planned to replace it with their own invented, occult, pagan religion centered around blood, soil, and the worship of the state itself.
Which brings us to the most audacious part of this intellectual heist. The kidnapping of the great thinkers.
This part is just tragic.
Because if you're building a fake intellectual empire, you need philosophers to back it up. A dictator in a uniform screaming into a microphone isn't a philosophy.
Right.
And the biggest, most tragically misused victim here has to be Friedrich Nietzsche.
Nietzsche was the absolute, unquestioned reference point for the fascist and Nazi elites. He was their philosophical patron saint.
But the irony here is so thick you could cut it with a knife. Adolf Hitler, a man who was fundamentally uncultured, who dropped out of school, and who lacked any real capacity for sustained, complex intellectual thought, constantly posed for photographs glaring intensely at busts of Nietzsche.
It's the ultimate pseudo-intellectual flex.
He even went to the funeral of Nietzsche's sister, right?
Yes, Elisabeth Förster Nietzsche. And her role is the crucial key to understanding this massive historical distortion.
Who was she, exactly?
Elisabeth was a devout Lutheran, a German nationalist, and a rabid anti-Semite.
Which is the exact opposite of her brother.
Exactly. Her brother, Friedrich Nietzsche, despised anti-Semites and German nationalism, but Nietzsche suffered a complete mental collapse and was incapacitated for the last decade of his life.
So she gets the keys to the kingdom. She just takes over his legacy.
She took total control of his massive archive of unpublished writings. She acted as his literary executor, and she ruthlessly edited, spliced, and forged his work to align with her own far-right anti-Semitic views.
That is unbelievable.
She is the one who welcomed Hitler, who gave him Nietzsche's walking stick, and who actively allowed the Nazi propaganda machine to grossly manipulate and bastardize her brother's complex philosophy to fit their brutal agenda.
So for the listener who maybe only knows Nietzsche from a Philosophy 101 class or like internet quotes, how exactly did the Nazis twist his ideas?
Well, the phrase that always comes up.
The Übermensch, the Superman.
Right, the Übermensch.
Yeah.
The Nazis took that concept and completely stripped it of its actual nuanced philosophical meaning. They literalized it.
They turned it into a biological and racial category.
Yes, they used it to justify the complete merciless destruction of Judeo-Christian compassion, arguing that it gave them philosophical permission, even a mandate, to assert the supremacy of the strong over the weak.
But to understand why this is such a gross, almost criminal distortion of his work, we have to look at why Nietzsche was writing in the first place. Like, what problem was he actually trying to solve?
Right. What was his context?
Just trying to solve the God is dead problem.
Yeah, exactly. Nietzsche wasn't writing a manual for dictators. He was diagnosing a cultural crisis. Nietzsche was originally meant to be a Lutheran priest, like his father.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah. But he lived through the late 19th century, a time when massive scientific discoveries, particularly Charles Darwin's theory of evolution, were sweeping across Europe.
And these discoveries were shattering traditional Christian beliefs.
Completely. Science had effectively debunked the religious framework that had anchored European society, morality, and meaning for thousands of years.
So, God is dead wasn't a celebration. It was a warning.
It was a terrified warning. Nietzsche saw that the collapse of religious truth would leave a terrifying moral and existential void.
Because if God doesn't dictate what is good and evil, what stops society from collapsing into absolute chaotic nihilism?
Exactly. He created his philosophy, and specifically the concept of the Übermensch, a person who has the profound psychological strength to create their own life-affirming values without relying on a sky god to fill that specific void left by the retreat of religion.
He envisioned a spiritual and cultural elevation, an overcoming of the self.
He absolutely did not create it to justify state terror, racial supremacy, or the industrial slaughter of millions of people.
But the Nazis didn't care about nuance. They needed a hammer. And they didn't just twist Nietzsche, they twisted Darwin too.
Oh, yes, social Darwinism.
Right. They took the theory of biological evolution, the idea of natural selection, and warped it. They claimed that the Aryan race wasn't just culturally superior, but the absolute biological pinnacle of human evolution.
Which is a terrifying intellectual leap, because once you establish yourself as the biological pinnacle, you conveniently render everyone else as, quote, expendable subhumans.
Yeah, it medicalizes prejudice.
Yeah.
It transforms extermination from a horrific moral crime into a sanitary biological necessity.
You aren't murdering people, you are simply weeding the evolutionary garden. They weaponized biology.
And reaching even further back into history, they weaponized classical Greek philosophy too. They leaned heavily into Plato.
They did.
But hold on, I'm struggling with Plato here. I get twisting Darwin for survival of the fittest, even if it's a bastardization. But Plato's the guy who literally invented the concept of the philosopher king. He's all about pure reason, rational debate, and elevating the intellect above all else. How on earth do you square pure Platonic reason with a fascist regime built on thousands of people screaming mindlessly at a midnight torchlight rally?
That is a fantastic question, and it cuts right to the heart of how these regimes cherry-picked history. You're right about the philosopher king, but you have to look at the other side of Plato.
This is another side.
First, Plato had a deep, profound distrust of democracy. He watched a democratic Athens execute his mentor, Socrates, so he hated the mob.
Oh, right.
He advocated for a rigidly stratified, authoritarian state where everyone knew their place and obedience was paramount. That obviously appealed to dictators.
Okay, the anti-democracy angle makes sense.
Yeah.
But what about the screaming rallies?
This is where it gets psychologically complex. The fascists latched on to Plato's exploration of the passions, the deep, irrational, almost divine frenzies that can overtake the human mind.
The stuff Nietzsche later categorized as the Dionysian impulse.
Exactly. The chaotic, intoxicating, instinctual energy of life. The fascists embraced this blind fervor over critical thinking. They essentially weaponized the Dionysian.
So it's the complete and total opposite of Aristotelian reason.
Yes. Aristotelian reason was measured, logical, analytical, and heavily reliant on evidence, a type of reason that the Nazis associated with Judeo-Christian and later Enlightenment values they so deeply hated.
So that completely explains the aesthetic of their leadership.
Oh, so?
When you watch old historical footage of fascist leaders like Hitler in Nuremberg or Mussolini on a balcony in Rome, with the wild, theatrical gesticulating, the red-faced screaming, the primal, almost animalistic cadence of their speeches.
Right.
They aren't just losing control. It's not a tantrum. They're actively, deliberately imitating this Platonic idea of passion.
They are performing a ritual designed to short-circuit the audience's Aristotelian logic and bypass their critical thinking entirely.
It's a highly calculated, intoxicating performance designed to induce blind fervor. You don't want the crowd analyzing your economic policies. You want them drunk on the collective emotion of the rally.
Precisely. And this brings us to a crucial pivot in our deep dive. Because grand philosophy, misread Nietzsche, and stolen Roman architecture are great for speeches.
But they weren't enough to justify a massive, bureaucratic, modern 20th century state.
No, they needed something that looked like hard science to validate their prejudices. They needed guys in lab coats with clipboards to tell the public that their hatred was scientifically sound.
So they turned to psychology. Or rather, they looked at the field of psychology, decided it was deeply threatening to their ideology, and completely gutted and remade it.
That's right.
The very first thing the Nazi regime did when they took over the scientific institutions was to immediately purge the psychological community of Sigmund Freud's school of psychoanalysis.
There were two primary reasons for this. The most obvious, given Nazi ideology, was deeply virulent anti-Semitism. Freud and a vast majority of his prominent followers and colleagues in the psychoanalytic movement were Jewish.
So their work was immediately dismissed as Jewish science and banned.
Yes. But the second reason was conceptual. Freudian psychoanalysis is deeply focused on introspection.
Right, looking inward.
It requires the individual to examine their childhood traumas, their repressed desires, and to question their own motivations.
Which is the absolute last thing a totalitarian state wants you doing. They don't want you analyzing your relationship with your father. They want you blindly obeying the fatherland.
Exactly. Introspection is lethal to fascism.
Because fascism requires the complete dissolution of the individual into the collective mass. Freud championed the individual mind, so Freud had to go.
And in the massive vacuum left by the expulsion of the Freudians, the Nazi scientific apparatus needed a replacement.
And they found one. They installed the famous Swiss psychoanalyst Carl Gustav Jung at the head of a newly aligned, acceptable German psychology.
Now, this is a heavy historical moment, because Jung is a titan of modern psychology.
Right. Why Jung? Why did the regime look at him and say, yes, this is the guy who can give us our scientific alibi?
What's fascinating here is the almost accidental yet incredibly convenient alignment of Jung's core theories with the emerging Nazi mythology.
How did they align?
Well, Jung's brand of psychoanalysis was built around the idea of archetypes, these universal mythic symbols and characters that he believed resided in a collective unconscious shared by humanity.
And conveniently for the regime, these archetypes mapped beautifully onto the ancient Germanic myths, the Volkish legends, and the pagan heroism that the Nazis were already exalting in their propaganda.
Exactly. It provided a psychological stamp of approval for their fairy tales. It took Wagnerian operas about dragons and swords and said, actually, this is deep psychological science.
It gave their mythology an academic pedigree. But the story goes deeper, and frankly, it gets incredibly bizarre.
It really does.
Because the upper echelons of the Nazi elite figures like Heinrich Himmler, who ran the SS, were deeply, fanatically obsessed with the occult, with mysticism, and with paranormal phenomena.
They were actively sending expeditions to Tibet to find the origins of the Aryan race and looking for the Holy Grail. They were essentially trying to build a new occultist religion.
Now, objectively speaking, if a group of heavily armed political leaders comes into a psychiatrist's office talking about their deep, literal belief in ancient magical bloodlines and occult destiny, a responsible medical professional might recommend an immediate stay in a psychiatric ward.
Right. You'd think the doctor would say, okay, let's put down the SS dagger and get you some serious antipsychotic medication.
But Jung indulged them.
He did. He may have been privately condescending. He often viewed himself as superior to politicians. But professionally and publicly, he accommodated these paranormal fixations. He legitimized their delusions by treating them as profound expressions of the collective unconscious.
And it went beyond just humoring them, didn't it?
Unfortunately, yes. Jung actually produced writings and theories during this period that differentiated between what he called the Germanic psyche, which he described as youthful, barbaric, and full of creative potential, and the Jewish psyche, which he characterized as older, more rigid, and less capable of producing its own culture.
That is wild. He essentially handed them a scientific, psychoanalytical framework that proved their racial hierarchy.
He did.
Now, we absolutely must pause and add the crucial historical caveat from the source material here. Jung remains a massive foundational figure in psychology today. And after the war, he was largely exonerated of being a true ideological Nazi sympathizer.
Yes, that is a very important point. Why was he exonerated?
Because it was later revealed that he was playing a very dangerous double game. He was secretly collaborating with the Allies, specifically the OSS, which was the precursor to the CIA.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, he was sending them highly detailed psychological profiles of Hitler and the Nazi leadership to help them predict their erratic behavior.
That is true, and it complicates his legacy immensely. But in the moment, during the 1930s, when the regime was consolidating its power and needed validation, his published theories were incredibly useful to them.
They needed a figure of his global stature to provide that scientific armor.
Because, and this is the crux of the whole essay, underneath all of this elaborate staging, underneath the hijacked Nietzschean philosophy, the fake Roman architecture, the warped Darwinian biology, and the carefully tailored Jungian psychology, the actual men wearing this heavy golden armor were incredibly devastatingly fragile.
Which brings us to the core revelation of this deep dive, the absolute staggering mediocrity of the dictators themselves.
That's quite a contrast.
We have been conditioned by the History Channel and decades of movies to see them as imposing monsters. Let's start with the architect of the worst horrors of the century, Adolf Hitler. The Nazi propaganda machine, run by Joseph Goebbels, spent a fortune selling him to the world as the ultimate virile, unyielding Übermensch, the savior of the bloodline.
But when historians and psychologists actually dig into his clinical reality, the picture is the exact opposite.
He was, at his core, profoundly mediocre and deeply damaged.
To understand him, we have to look closely at his origins. He wasn't born into an aristocratic warrior caste. He was born in a very small, deeply isolated agricultural region in rural Austria, near the border.
And the text we are analyzing explicitly notes that this specific geographical environment was historically marked by heavy generations of inbreeding.
Yes. The gene pool was incredibly restricted, which modern science recognizes as a known breeding ground for a variety of behavioral, physical, and mental disorders.
And the specific family dynamic inside his house was deeply dysfunctional, bordering on Gothic. His father, Elwes, was an abusive, violent, illegitimate man who was obsessed with minor bureaucratic status.
And Elwes married his own much younger cousin, Clara, who became Hitler's deeply submissive mother.
That kind of oppressive, violent, and highly insular environment produced a psyche that was absolutely riddled with insecurities, resentments, and complexes.
Intellectually, Hitler was a void. He was devoid of any real, rigorous intellectual brilliance.
In fact, he actively, violently despised complex academic debate. He hated intellectuals.
Why? Because he was simply incapable of participating in it. He couldn't hold his own in a room of genuine, educated thinkers. He lacked the vocabulary, the patience, and the logical capacity.
So his solution was brutally simple. Since he couldn't win an argument against intellectuals, he opted to physically destroy the intellectuals instead. He burned their books and sent them to camps.
It's the ultimate inferiority complex manifesting as state policy.
And the essay dives deep into his hidden personal life, which completely shatters that manufactured virile leader image.
It really does.
The historical and psychological investigations cited in the text point to a man suffering from severe sexual deviances and crippling intimacy issues.
Yes. Far from the dominant masculine archetype he projected to the roaring crowds, the accumulated historical evidence points to severe masochistic paraphilias, a deep-seated fear of normal adult sexuality, and even pedophilic tendencies in his early youth.
He was incapable of forming a healthy, reciprocal romantic relationship.
The essay highlights the incredibly dark and tragic testimonies surrounding the women who were intimately involved with him, specifically his much younger half-niece, Galli Ball, and the famous German actress Renate Müller.
The details here are incredibly dark, and they reveal so much about the psychology of power. Hitler became obsessed with both of these women at different times, but he didn't treat them like partners. He essentially kept them as prisoners.
And he forced them into sexual practices that were deeply humiliating and degrading for them, purely to serve his own bizarre masochistic needs.
He needed them to degrade him behind closed doors to balance out the godlike worship he demanded in public.
And the text points out a terrifying detail about Renate Müller, the actress. She was known within German high society to be a bit of a gossip.
Which is an incredibly dangerous personality trait when you are dealing with a totalitarian dictator who is desperately, violently hiding his profound personal inadequacies from the world.
Exactly. If the German public knew that their infallible Übermensch was actually engaging in submissive, humiliating acts, the entire illusion of the regime would collapse overnight.
Both of these women, Galli Ball and Renate Müller, died in highly suspicious, sudden circumstances.
The regime's machinery immediately and very conveniently cataloged both deaths as suicides. The SS and the police meticulously scrubbed the scenes, intimidated witnesses, and erased any proof of their leaders' perversions.
They murdered or silenced anyone who could threaten the illusion of the Superman.
So when we pull back the camera, what does this all mean? When you strip away the massive rallies at Nuremberg, the searchlights piercing the night sky, and the screaming speeches, what are you actually left with?
You are left with a sad, deeply broken man whose only genuinely normal, uncomplicated emotional bond in his entire life was his obsessive relationship with his German shepherd, Blondie.
Because a dog cannot judge you, cannot challenge your intellect, and cannot reveal your secrets.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the entire apparatus of state power, the invasions, and the unimaginable violence weren't the tools of a grand, dark visionary executing a master plan.
No, they were the ultimate, horrific compensation mechanism for profound, crippling personal inadequacy. The state, the military, the Gestapo, they simply became his instruments for punishing the entire world for his own psychological defects.
That is a chilling, paradigm-shifting way to look at history. It's not evil genius, it's weaponized patheticness.
It truly is.
And what's fascinating is that this mechanism isn't unique to Germany. If we pivot geographically to Spain and look at the dictator Francisco Franco, we see a completely different flavor of mediocrity, but the exact same psychological mechanism of massive overcompensation.
Franco is, in many ways, arguably even more barren intellectually than Hitler.
Really? How so?
He lacked even the fake, pasteboard philosophical vision of the Nazis. Hitler at least tried to pretend he understood Nietzsche. Franco had no real political ideology of his own, no humanistic training, no curiosity about the world outside of Spain.
So what was his mental framework?
His entire worldview was severely limited to an incredibly outdated, rural, superstitious Catholicism he inherited from his mother, combined with the rigid, unimaginative, unquestioning life of a 19th century military barracks.
Right. He wasn't spending his evenings posing with busts of philosophers. He was a pure, brutal pragmatist. But just like Hitler, he harbored a massive, corrosive inferiority complex.
And for Franco, it stemmed directly from the deepest source of all, his own family.
His father, Nicholas Franco, was a naval officer and a somewhat liberal, free-thinking, cosmopolitan man who openly, actively despised Francisco.
Yes, thought Francisco was small, weak, and narrow-minded.
But the real issue, the real psychological phantom haunting Francisco Franco his entire life, was his younger brother, Ramon.
Oh, Ramon. Ramon Franco was, in almost every conceivable way, everything Francisco was not. Ramon was charismatic, daring, and brilliant. He was the genuine, undeniable hero of the family and of the nation.
In the 1920s, Ramon was a world-famous aviator. He piloted a seaplane called the Plus Ultra across the Atlantic to South America, becoming an international celebrity.
He was a dashing rebel, a political anarchist, a known libertine who enjoyed the bohemian nightlife, and crucially, he was a prominent Freemason.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting and where psychology bleeds directly into history. Let's use an analogy here.
Sure.
Imagine you are Francisco Franco. You are rigid, deeply conservative, awkward, and despised by your own father. You watch your younger brother break all the rules, fly airplanes, get all the glory, and hang out with the intellectual elite in the Masonic lodges. So what do?
You try to join the club.
Exactly. Franco, wanting that validation, tried to join the Freemasons himself, not once but twice.
And he was formally rejected both times.
And we absolutely cannot overstate the profound psychological impact of that double rejection on a fragile ego.
In early 20th century Spain, the Freemasons weren't just a secret society. They represented the liberal elite, the free-thinking circles, the intellectuals, the politicians, exactly the kind of men his father respected and his brother belonged to.
So being formally denied entry by these men was a profound, deeply humiliating personal rejection. It confirmed his father's assessment that he wasn't good enough.
Wait, let me get this straight. You're telling me that a significant portion of a world historical tragedy, the deaths of tens of thousands of people, was essentially the geopolitical equivalent of a guy getting rejected by a college fraternity and deciding to burn the entire campus down?
Pretty much. How does a man with the intellectual capacity of a barrack soldier process that kind of humiliation?
He doesn't process it therapeutically. He turns it into state policy.
This personal stinging rejection didn't just fade away. It metastasized into a psychopathic, lifelong resentment.
It was the direct birthplace of his absolute paranoid, defining obsession with what he called the Judeo-Masonic conspiracy.
When he took power, he didn't just dislike Masons. He became obsessed with hunting them down. He used this fabricated global conspiracy to justify the systematic extermination of thousands of teachers, politicians, and intellectuals.
It's like a societal autoimmune disease. The dictator, damaged by a past trauma, misidentifies a healthy part of the society, the free-thinking intellectuals, as a lethal threat, and orders the military immune system to ruthlessly destroy it.
He was quite literally projecting his deep personal feelings of inadequacy onto an entire demographic and murdering them as a form of therapy.
The level of delusion is just staggering, and it goes even further, right into the realm of the absurd when you look at how he handled his brother's legacy.
Because his brother Ramon, the famous Mason, actually pragmatically switched sides and joined Franco's fascist forces when the Civil War broke out.
But then, Ramon died in a plane crash during a bombing mission. A normal regime would just accept it as an accident of war.
But the Franco regime couldn't accept a simple reality, because having a famous, globally recognized Freemason brother was a permanent, unforgivable stain on the dictator's pure, ultra-Catholic, anti-Masonic image.
It was an intolerable contradiction. So, the regime's propaganda machine absurdly claimed that the Freemasons had secretly infiltrated the airbase and sabotaged Ramon's plane.
They literally invented a spy novel narrative. They spread a story that on the exact day of the crash, Masonic agents broke into Ramon's private home to steal a manuscript he was supposedly writing.
A manuscript that was magically going to expose all the evil lies of international Freemasonry. It was a complete desperate fabrication designed solely to wash the Masonic stain off the dictator's family name.
It is genuinely staggering to realize that state history was being rewritten on the fly to cover up a dictator's jealous brother complex.
It is.
So you have Franco, a man defined by massive personal complexes and resentments. He needs a brutal, highly efficient mechanism to exercise this resentment and physically control a rebellious population. He doesn't have the grand bureaucratic vision of the German SS.
No, he doesn't.
So where does he learn how to manage a country through terror? He imports his methodology directly from the colonies.
This brings us to a crucial historical dynamic: the Africanist terror. Because Franco lacked any philosophical or intellectual foundation, his true school, the place where he learned how the world works, was the brutal, grinding colonial wars in North Africa.
Specifically in Morocco in the 1920s.
He was part of a clique of hardened military officers known as the Africanists. Out in the desert, far from the rules of European engagement, these officers developed a military strategy that wasn't just about tactically defeating an enemy army. It was entirely based on the concept of psychological terror.
We are talking about horrific, deeply inhuman stuff here. This wasn't standard combat. It was the deliberate use of mutilations, the public display of severed heads, and the systematic massacre of completely defenseless civilian populations.
The goal wasn't just victory. The goal was to deploy such implacable theatrical brutality that it completely paralyzed the native enemy population with absolute fear.
And the chilling part is that when the Spanish Civil War broke out in 1936, Franco and his Africanist generals didn't switch to a different doctrine.
They consciously, deliberately imported this exact same colonial doctrine of terror to use against their own citizens.
The systematic repression, the mass executions of teachers and union leaders in the bull rings, the policy of leaving bodies in the ditches to traumatize the towns, none of this was accidental collateral damage.
It was the precise, deliberate application of their Moroccan military doctrine to the Spanish working class.
Because in their minds, just like in the African colonies, the enemy, in this case the Spanish Republican, the socialist, the liberal, wasn't considered a fellow citizen with a different opinion. They were viewed as an expendable subhuman, an infection in the body politic.
Which made annihilation not just acceptable, but merely a necessary avatar of war. If the enemy is subhuman, you don't owe them the rules of war. It justified a complete, total lack of empathy.
But applying this terror required a unified machine, and Franco had a major problem. He had to impose this brutal, unified military discipline on a political movement that was a deeply fractured, chaotic mess.
Spanish fascism was an absolute contradictory disaster from the very beginning.
It really was. The origins of the Falange, the original Spanish fascist party, are incredibly chaotic. It wasn't a unified brain trust. It was founded by three leaders who had completely irreconcilable worldviews. You could barely put them in the same room.
Let's break them down. First, you have José Antonio Primo de Rivera. He was a wealthy aristocrat, the son of a former dictator, and he was essentially imposed as the charismatic face of the party by the Spanish economic elite.
He had this outdated, romantic, almost poetic vision of restoring Spain's imperial 16th century past. He was an elite capitalist playing at revolution.
Then you have a totally different figure, Ramiro Ledesma. He came from a much more humble, working-class background. He was an intellectual, despite lacking formal university degrees, and he was a radical nihilist.
He didn't care about the Catholic Church or the aristocracy.
No, Ledesma had strong, genuine leanings toward the German model of Nazi-style National Socialism. He wanted a real, violent workers' revolution, just led by the right wing instead of the left.
And then the third founder, Onésimo Redondo, throws another wrench into the gears. He is completely different from the aristocrat and the Nazi.
Redondo was an ultra-Catholic rural zealot. He was deeply anti-Semitic and profoundly influenced by the powerful Jesuit order.
In fact, Redondo was the one who personally translated and published the infamous, fabricated anti-Semitic text, The Protocols of the Elders of Zion, in the official Falangist newspaper. He wanted a religious crusade.
So consider that leadership table. You have an elite aristocrat funded by banks, a working-class radical who admires Hitler's socialism, and an ultra-Catholic zealot acting as a proxy for the Jesuits.
It's a miracle they didn't kill each other on day one.
The Falange was a marginal, confused party. Before the Civil War, it had almost zero voters in democratic elections. It was mostly known for sending angry young men into the streets to commit acts of terrorism and violence. It was destined to fracture and fail.
But Franco, who was the ultimate cold-blooded pragmatist, saw an opportunity and hijacked it.
He essentially performed a hostile military takeover of a political party.
Once the Civil War started and the original leaders were dead or sidelined, Franco stepped in. He forced all these warring factions, the fascists, the traditionalist monarchists, the ultra-Catholics, together into a single, unified state party under his absolute command.
And if you didn't agree with the merger, you were out. He ruthlessly jailed the leaders of the pro-Nazi radical faction, like Manuel Hedilla, who thought Franco was betraying the true fascist revolution.
And this internal power struggle, this shifting of alliances to keep control, never really stopped during his 40-year dictatorship. The text notes a massive structural power shift that occurred post-1953.
In the early decades, the regime was autarkic, economically isolated, and highly traditional, backed by the Jesuits. But by the 1950s, Spain was bankrupt.
So what changed?
A new, highly secretive Catholic sect entered the center of power, Opus Dei. Opus Dei technocrats began pushing the regime hard toward a modern capitalist model, demanding integration with the global market and alignment with the United States to save the economy.
This sparked a vicious, behind-the-scenes power struggle with the original, more socialist-leaning, anti-capitalist phalangists.
And it completely changed the religious backing of the regime, too. Opus Dei effectively replaced the powerful Jesuit order as the primary moral and economic sustainers of Spanish fascism.
For those of us who aren't experts on internal Catholic power struggles, what is the actual difference here? Why does a dictator swap one religious order for another?
It's a fascinating historical footnote about adaptability. The Jesuits were historically deeply intellectual, highly educated, and somewhat independent thinkers within the church. Over time, that intellectual independence led many Jesuits to deeply question the morality of extreme inequality. Eventually, decades later, many Jesuit thinkers actually moved toward liberation theology, a movement that argued the church should actively fight for the poor and oppressed.
Which is not great for a fascist dictator.
Exactly. In later years, conservative factions in the Vatican and right-wing governments actually accused the Jesuits of instigating communism and backing Marxist guerrilla movements in Latin America.
And Opus Dei?
Opus Dei, on the other hand, was much more focused on individual piety, combined with aggressive technocratic success in the capitalist world. They were perfect for a dictator who needed to modernize his economy without liberalizing his politics.
The alliance has constantly shifted, based entirely on who could keep Franco in power, not in any fixed philosophical principle. But while the factions fought, the deep systemic cruelty of the regime remained an absolute constant.
Yes, the cruelty was structural.
And one of the most chilling dystopian details in this essay is how they handled the massive population they conquered at the end of the Civil War. The regime leadership actually sat down and seriously considered physically exterminating all Spanish Republicans.
They debated a policy of total physical annihilation of the losing half of the country.
That is just incomprehensible.
But they ultimately realized that industrial-scale slaughter of millions of their own citizens long after the war had ended clashed too jarringly with the pious, ultra-Catholic, peaceful image they were desperately trying to project to the rest of the world.
They couldn't build Auschwitz in the middle of Spain while claiming to be the defenders of the Catholic faith. They needed a more insidious alternative.
So instead of physical extermination, they chose cultural extermination. They implemented a massive system of forced re-education, and their primary targets were the most vulnerable, the children.
Thousands upon thousands of children of the defeated Republicans, or children whose parents were in prison, were literally stolen by the state.
They were ripped from their families, told their parents were dead or didn't want them, and put into state-run orphanages and institutions operated by Falangist loyalists, priests, and Catholic nuns.
It was an aggressive, systematic program of psychological brainwashing. The explicit goal was to erase their family identities, teach them to hate their parents' ideologies, and rip the evil Marxist seed out by the roots.
And tragically, the source text notes that this absolute power corrupted absolutely. Many of these stolen children were subjected to severe physical, emotional, and sexual abuse, along with profoundly degrading treatment hidden behind the closed doors of these religious institutions.
But to justify this horrific, massive program of child theft to themselves, they needed an intellectual alibi. They couldn't just say, we are stealing children to punish our enemies.
Right. They needed their own Spanish version of Nazi pseudoscience. They needed a medical, scientific reason to declare that Republican parents were biologically unfit.
So they turned to a military psychiatrist named Antonio Vallejo Nájera.
Vallejo Nájera is a critical, deeply sinister figure in this history. He was tasked with medicalizing the political purge.
What did he actually do?
He conducted clinical tests on Republican prisoners of war, specifically targeting female prisoners, and he officially concluded that Marxism wasn't a choice. It wasn't a political ideology. He declared it was a literal biological and mental defect.
He claimed, in published scientific papers, to have discovered a red gene.
Yes!
I need to know the how here. How on earth does a psychiatrist design a medical test to prove a political ideology is genetic? What were his metrics? Did he just draw blood?
The methodology was pure, terrifying pseudoscience. He used anthropometrics, literally measuring the skulls and physical features of prisoners.
Oh, wow.
But he went further. He conducted psychological questionnaires, heavily focused on female prisoners in places like the Malaga prison. He asked them about their sexual histories, their religious beliefs, and their adherence to traditional gender roles.
And how did he interpret the answers?
He took their answers, which often reflected poverty, lack of education, or simply modern liberal views on women's rights, and diagnosed these traits as female depravity. He then scientifically linked this depravity directly to Marxist political beliefs.
So he argued that left-wing politics were a symptom of a diseased, inferior genetic makeup.
Exactly. But the expert analysis in the text points out a crucial distinction here. This wasn't pure Darwinian biological racism like the Nazis practiced with their Aryan myth.
Right. The Spanish fascists couldn't really pull off the pure Aryan blood argument, given Spain's incredibly diverse, mixed Mediterranean history of Romans, Visigoths, and Moors.
A pure biological argument wouldn't work in Spain. Instead, Vallejo Nájera created a distinctly Spanish brand of pseudoscience. It was a toxic blend of deep classism and religious racism.
It was, quite literally, a direct hangover from the Spanish Inquisition. In the days of the Inquisition, they had the concept of limpieza de sangre, purity of blood, which meant you had no Jewish or Muslim ancestors.
Vallejo Nájera updated this. His red gene theory was the idea that heresy, poverty, and political dissent were literal, inheritable diseases that needed to be purged from the national bloodstream.
And what's wild, what really brings this into the present day, is how the legacy of this pseudoscience survives. The essay points out the modern context of this specific family name.
The descendants of Vallejo Nájera retained immense power and controlled Spanish psychiatry during the decades of the dictatorship, effectively setting the entire medical field back by 50 years.
But even today, long after the dictatorship has fallen, the name Vallejo Nájera is incredibly famous in Spanish high society.
It is a ubiquitous name in modern Spanish pop culture. You see the name attached to prominent media figures. One of them is a famous, beloved judge on a massively popular TV cooking competition.
Wait, really? A cooking show?
Yes. You see the name attached to highly successful businessmen and wealthy playboys featured in the glossy tabloid magazines.
But the name isn't famous for scientific contributions anymore. The essay suggests a much darker, subliminal reason for this ongoing fame. It acts as a kind of cultural flex by the ghost of the regime.
When the public sees that name thriving, wealthy, and on television, it's a coded subconscious message that the superior genes of the fascist elite always end up prospering.
They always end up dominating society, no matter what happens to the political system. The dictatorship may be gone, but the winners remain the winners.
And the collateral damage done to the actual medical field in Spain was profound and lasting. Under the fascists, Spanish psychiatry didn't just stagnate, it regressed entirely.
Patients with genuine mental illnesses were treated as subhumans, locked away, and hidden out of shame.
The regime essentially discarded modern psychology and psychoanalysis because, as we discussed with Freud, introspection was dangerous. They relied on primitive, punitive methods.
Often backed by the moral authority of the Catholic Church, they utilized brutal treatments like forced electric shocks and conversion therapies for homosexuals.
People were locked away for life in massive, squalid public asylums run by religious orders, treated essentially as moral failures with almost zero chance of ever receiving actual medical help or reintegrating into society.
It became an entire ecosystem of cruelty. And that is a perfect transition point for us, because when a state is built on pseudoscience, when it uses terror as its primary tool, and when it is led by men with profound, unchecked psychological defects, psychopathy stops being a bug in the system.
It becomes a feature. In fact, it becomes the primary requirement for career advancement. If the state's goal is brutality, the most brutal men will rise to the top.
The glorification of violence treating brutality not as a necessary evil, but as a philosophical virtue, was fundamental to all European fascist ideologies. At the individual level, within the ranks of the party and the military, psychopathy was actively identified and rewarded. Let's look closely at the Nazi criminal network that managed the terror.
The essay highlights some specific terrifying figures that prove this point. Take Reinhard Heydrich.
This is a guy who, before the Nazis took power, was officially expelled from the German Naval Academy for bad conduct and dishonorable behavior regarding a woman. In a normal, functioning democratic society, a disgraced military expulsion means your career in public service is over. You are a pariah.
But the Nazi Party wasn't a normal society. It was the perfect welcoming refuge for his highly organized, violent character. He didn't just join the party, he became the primary architect of its terror.
His lack of empathy was his greatest asset. He was the man who systematically dismantled German democracy from the inside, eliminated political opponents with cold precision, and built the terrifying apparatus of the Gestapo.
And his psychopathy was systemic, not just individual. When he was eventually assassinated by resistance fighters in Prague, the Nazis didn't just conduct a police investigation to find the killers.
They unleashed a brutal, massive, disproportionate repression against the entire Czech civilian population, destroying whole villages like Litidy, as an act of pure psychopathic revenge and to send a message of absolute terror.
And then you go a level down from the organizers like Heydrich to the men actually executing the violence on the ground. Figures like Oskar Dirlewanger.
This is one of the most depraved stories of the war. Dirlewanger was a convicted, imprisoned pedophile. In any society, he is locked away for public safety.
But the Nazis actually pulled him out of prison because they recognized his utility. First, they sent him to fight in the Spanish Civil War on Franco's side to practice his brutality.
And then, during World War II, they put him in charge of an entire SS brigade composed almost entirely of other convicted murderers, poachers, and rapists.
They intentionally let him loose in Poland and the Eastern Front, essentially giving him a license to commit unspeakable sadistic atrocities against civilians, because it served their goal of terrorizing the conquered populations.
The SS specifically deliberately instrumentalized psychopaths. It wasn't an accident that bad men slipped through the cracks. It was a targeted hiring strategy. They needed people who wouldn't hesitate.
You see it most clearly in the concentration camps. You have sadistic medical figures like Josef Mengele, who possessed no medical ethics whatsoever. You have the infamous female guards who became legendary for their personalized cruelty. Maria Mandel, who's known as the Beast of Auschwitz and enjoyed watching executions. Ilsach at Buchenwald, who collected macabre souvenirs. Irma Grease.
And they pushed the psychology of the camps even further into depravity by corrupting the victims themselves. They intentionally used the most violent, sadistic prisoners, the capos, often actual criminals, to guard the barracks.
They tasked the prisoners with carrying out the daily punishments and murders of their fellow inmates in exchange for slightly better rations. The regime didn't punish psychopathy, they weaponized it to ensure the camps ran on a self-sustaining loop of terror.
And in Spain, while lacking the massive industrial scale of the SS, this validation of violence was dressed up in a different aesthetic. It was dressed up as aristocratic heroism. We mentioned José Antonio Primo de Rivera earlier, the wealthy, aristocratic founder of the Falange.
Right, the guy who had this elite high society pedigree, tailored suits, and a poetic speaking style. But his actual practical political behavior consisted of getting into literal, physical fistfights on the floor of the national parliament when someone disagreed with him.
In any functioning civil society, a politician punching a rival in parliament is the behavior of a common thug. It's a disgrace.
But his fascist sycophants didn't see it that way. They praised it as the highest, purest form of intellect. They actually coined a phrase for it. They called it the dialectics of fists and pistols.
They actively elevated street violence and murder to the level of profound political philosophy. If you shoot your opponent, you have won the debate.
And the legacy of that specific glorification of violence is something we still see echoing today. If we connect this to the bigger picture, this normalization of violence was essential to building what the essay calls the Iberian macho archetype.
To hold up the flimsy scaffolding of their regime, they needed to construct a collective national morality that everyone was forced to adhere to. So they promoted and enforced this figure of the Iberian macho.
It was a highly specific template. A tough, physically dominant, emotionally stunted, intensely misogynist man whose masculinity was aggressive and unquestionable. It's an image that the reactionary sectors in Spain, deeply supported by the conservative wings of the Catholic Church, promoted and celebrated for decades as the ideal citizen.
And the modern contrast we see in European politics right now is fascinating. The text points out that today, other far-right, highly conservative leaders across Europe have somewhat softened their stance on certain social issues to broaden their appeal. You even have some prominent European far-right leaders who are openly gay or lesbian, leading deeply nationalist parties.
But the Spanish far-right remains deeply, rigidly bound to that historical archetype. It remains intensely homophobic. That level of openness or modern social integration is still largely unthinkable in those specific political circles in Spain today.
The ghost of the Iberian macho still dictates the terms, and the essay tragically notes the real-world consequence of this legacy. Violence against the LGBTQ+ community in Spain continues to rise, consistently leading hate crime statistics in the country. The Iberian macho complex is still decades later, demanding victims to validate its own fragile masculinity.
Because at the end of the day, that hyper-masculinity is just a mask. It's a performance. This rigid, violently aggressive hyper-masculinity demanded in public was almost always a desperate cover for deep, chaotic sexual and emotional repression behind closed doors.
And this brings us to the final, perhaps most complex section of our deep dive, the psychosexual labyrinth of these regimes.
To truly understand the root of this ideology of brutality, we have to look closely at the extreme psychological dissonance it required. The public propaganda demanded strict moral castration purity, traditional families, chaste women, but the private reality of the men running the system was incredibly chaotic and transgressive.
The essay references a fascinating, though deeply flawed, 1949 work by an anarchist intellectual named Eugen Relges, who wrote extensively about the sexual aberrations flourishing inside Nazi Germany.
Now, we need to clarify something right away so we don't spread historical misinformation. Relges had a central, overarching theory that modern historians have entirely debunked. He seriously suggested that high-ranking, aristocratic German diplomats literally started the world wars just to satisfy a massive geopolitical sexual fetish for rugged militaristic men in uniforms.
He based this wild theory on the Eulenburg scandal from the early 1900s, where a very close friend and advisor of the Kaiser was accused of homosexuality, which caused a massive political crisis. Though modern analysis shows that scandal was highly likely fabricated by his political opponents to ruin him.
Right. We have to discard the macro theory. The idea that World War I was started as a massive geopolitical fetish played by a cabal of diplomats is simply not supported by any serious historical evidence. However, where Relges' psychoanalytic approach does hold undeniable value, and why the essay includes him, is in his courage to expose the true, highly complex homosexual reality that existed right within the absolute core of the Nazi power structure. He saw the hypocrisy.
The most glaring, undeniable historical example of this is the SA, the Sturmabteilung. This was the original, massive paramilitary wing of the Nazi Party, the street brawlers. It was led by a man named Ernst Röhm. And Röhm wasn't hiding in the closet. He wasn't subtle. He was an openly, notoriously gay man who frequented gay bars in Berlin.
And crucially, he was Adolf Hitler's only real close personal friend. He was the only man who addressed Hitler with the informal du.
Röhm was incredibly powerful, commanding millions of men. He was essential to Hitler's rise to power. But then, in 1934, you have the Night of the Long Knives. This was a massive, sudden, bloody purge where Hitler ordered the SS to arrest and murder Röhm and the entire top leadership of the SA.
For a very long time, the public narrative fed by Nazi propaganda was that Hitler suddenly discovered Röhm's homosexuality, was morally outraged, and purged the SA to cleanse the party of perverts and restore pristine moral purity.
But that is a complete myth. Hitler knew about Röhm's sexuality for over a decade and didn't care as long as Röhm was useful. The purge had absolutely nothing to do with moral purity. It was an act of brutal, calculated political Darwinism. Hitler used Röhm's homosexuality merely as a convenient, scandalous excuse for the public.
The real hidden goal of the purge was twofold. First, to eliminate the massive socialist-leaning wing of the Nazi Party, which was heavily represented by the SA and the Strasser brothers, who actually wanted to redistribute wealth. And second, to appease the traditional German army generals who feared the massive SA, allowing Hitler to consolidate absolute, unquestioned power by merging the remaining SA forces into the much more obedient elite SS.
Röhm's sexuality wasn't the reason he died. It was just the PR weapon Hitler used to execute a dangerous political rival.
It was violence utilized strictly as an internal corporate management tool. But this extreme, officially sanctioned public homophobia and misogyny created a bizarre, terrifying paradox in how they managed their own citizens.
The regime officially relegated German women to the status of mere breeding machines. Their only value to the state was to produce as many pure Aryan soldiers as possible. To achieve this massive demographic goal, the supposedly conservative regime actually strongly encouraged sexual promiscuity and out-of-wedlock extramarital affairs as long as both parties were racially pure Aryans. They even set up the Lebensborn program, essentially state-sponsored breeding clinics.
The hypocrisy is staggering, and the education system they built for the youth, the Hitlerjugend, or Hitler Youth, was completely detached from the traditional Christian values they supposedly defended. It was deeply, aggressively sexualized, but oriented entirely towards sadism and domination.
The text notes that young men in the Hitler Youth were actively, systematically taught to use violence and domination in their sexual encounters to prove their masculinity. And young women in the corresponding female organizations were explicitly taught to submissively accept that male violence and infidelity as part of their patriotic duty to the state. Their bodies belong to the fatherland.
It was an entire state-run assembly line designed to produce emotionally stunted, brutalized, sociopathic individuals who could not form healthy attachments, making them perfectly loyal only to the state. And there's a truly fascinating, deeply ironic paradox here mentioned in the source material regarding modern Spain.
Yes. This is where the history bends back on itself. Today, certain factions of Spanish neo-Nazis actually emulate this specific, promiscuous, pagan Nazi German model. They copy the tattoos, the aesthetics, and the social attitudes of the SS, which completely fundamentally contradicts the highly traditional, deeply chaste, ultra-Catholic morality that the actual Spanish fascist regime, the one their grandfathers fought for, violently forced on the country for 40 years. They are cosplaying as German fascists, entirely ignoring their own historical national ideology.
It is the ultimate proof that these modern extremist movements aren't about adhering to a coherent historical philosophy. They don't care about the intellectual consistency of Franco's Catholicism versus Hitler's paganism. They are simply grabbing whatever pieces of historical aesthetic and ideology allow them to justify their own primal instincts, prejudices, and desire for violence today. Relgis's essay also touches on another hidden reality of the era, the psychological environment of the military trenches.
Right. Secret military reports on the German high command during the war showed shockingly high levels of situational homosexuality in the ranks, which deeply alarmed the leadership who were officially sending homosexuals to concentration camps.
When you take millions of young men, isolate them in horrific conditions, and combine the intense trauma-bonded camaraderie of the trenches with a state-sponsored, omnipresent cult of death, it inevitably creates a powerful emotional and psychological escape valve. Soldiers weren't just fighting abstractly for the state or the Führer. Many were fighting ferociously, displaying incredible bravery specifically to protect their beloved comrades or to exact terrible vengeance for their deaths.
The regime found itself trapped in a paradox. They publicly condemned and criminalized homosexuality, while simultaneously practically relying on the intense, profound emotional and erotic bonds between the men in the trenches to fuel their relentless war machine.
So we've covered a massive amount of ground here. Let's pull it all together. So what does this all mean? We've traced the fake Roman philosophy, the hijacked Nietzsche, the weaponized pseudoscience of Jung and Vallejo Nájera. We've exposed the profound, pathetic mediocrity and sexual complexes of the leaders themselves, and the chaotic, hypocritical repression of their societies. Where does this historical trajectory actually end up? It brings us to the ultimate, almost comedic historical irony of the Spanish regime.
Francisco Franco, as we established early on, had no real anchoring philosophy. He wasn't a true believer in anything other than himself. He was the ultimate political chameleon whose only true ideology was his own survival and power. And to ensure that survival, when the geopolitical winds changed after World War II and the onset of the Cold War, he committed the ultimate ideological betrayal of his own fascist roots.
He looked at the shattered, smoking ruins of Nazi Germany and Mussolini's Italy, and he immediately dropped the pure anti-capitalist fascist rhetoric. He abandoned the phalangist dream of autarky, and he completely sold out to United States capitalism. He allowed the U.S. military to build massive strategic bases right on Spanish soil, trading national sovereignty to buy American protection, international recognition, and the economic loans needed to ensure his regime survived the 20th century.
And because of that massive pragmatic betrayal, today's true fascist purists and neo-Nazis in Spain, the ones who study the ideology, actually deeply despise the memory of Francisco Franco. They view him as a pathetic sellout, a traitor to the cause. The only historical figure from that era they genuinely respect and revere is Ramiro Ledesma, the radical nihilist founder we mentioned earlier, who actually wanted a true, violent National Socialist revolution and died early in the war before he could compromise.
It is the final, pathetic punchline to a horrific, bloody era. The all-powerful dictator who ruled a nation with an iron fist for 40 long years isn't even respected by his own ideological descendants today. They think he was a fraud.
So, to bring this all together for you listening, when you look behind the curtain, the grand, terrifying intellectual architecture of fascism was entirely papier-mâché. It was a hollow chocolate bunny. There were no supermen. There were no brilliant dark philosophers guiding a nation toward a higher historical destiny. Behind the curtain, there were only deeply, tragically mediocre individuals. They were men driven entirely by undiagnosed clinical disorders, pathetic daddy issues, jealousy of the brothers, and deep pathological resentment. They were men who were so fundamentally incapable of functioning normally in a complex, diverse world that they had to resort to the ultimate extreme, inventing an alternate reality of state terror just so they'd interface with the world without feeling small.
It's a profoundly sobering realization, but it is an absolutely essential one for understanding history. Demystifying these monsters is the first step in disarming them. And it leaves us with a critical, urgent question to consider as we look away from the 1930s and look at the world today. When you observe modern political movements, the rallies, the rhetoric, the anger, how often are grand aesthetics, historical nostalgia, and cherry-picked philosophy being used right now today to mask a fundamental, total lack of actual policy? Or worse, how often is all that noise simply being used to hide the deep, personal, unhealed insecurities of the people leading them?
It's a question that reframes every speech you'll ever watch, something to keep a very close eye on. Thanks for joining us on this incredibly deep dive. We'll catch you next time.